Hello, I'm Bob Bauer. I'm very fortunate to be able to moderate this panel on the President and the President's Chiefs of Staff. And I have served one of these two gentlemen, Pete Rouse, and I know, as everybody in Washington does, about the other, Ken Duberstein. Both have been Chiefs of Staff to presidents, and I want to emphasize, beyond what you see in their formal program biographies, that they have been both formal and informal advisors to presidents, both advising presidents in their capacities as chiefs of staff, and very frequently called upon to give advice to senior members of Congress and to the President of the United States, even when they have not been in the government. And so I'm going to leave you, because we want, in the interest of time, to get going here, I'm going to leave you for the details to the detailed biographies in the program, and welcome both Ken and Pete, and thank them for being here. I should mention, I've been in the White House and I've worked for Pete as Chief of Staff and for a couple of other Chiefs of Staff, so I'm pleased today also to try to find out what it is exactly that they do. And this should be illuminating for me as well as for the audience. Let me begin, just kick it off if I could, by asking this question. If you were to identify for the Chief of Staff to the President of the United States what the challenges are in order of priority, what is first, second, third, and on the list of things that you most have to worry about on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis, what would you say that would be?
Okay, well, is this on now? Yep, okay. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate this opportunity to participate in this discussion of White House decision-making with Bob, who, as you mentioned, was a colleague of mine in the Obama White House and is a longtime lawyer and still lawyer for President Obama, and with Ken Duberstein, whose reputation and influence as an advisor to presidents for nearly 4 decades has elevated him to virtually iconic status, at least in my line of work. So I'm delighted to be here with both these folks. My frame of reference for presidential decision-making was largely informed by the 10 years I spent as Chief of Staff to Senate Democratic leader Tom Daschle from 1995 to 2005, under 2 presidents, 6 years under Democratic President Bill Clinton, and 4 years under Republican President George W. Bush. And then, of course, the 5 years I spent in the Obama White House. And I must admit at the outset that the experience of the last 10 months has caused me to revisit some of my prior assumptions about presidential decision-making. But I think that's probably a question left for a different question. In any event, I'd respond to Bob's question in 2 parts. First, by focusing on what I view as the primary responsibility of the White House Chief of Staff, and then emphasizing the importance of organization, process, and discipline in managing a somewhat chaotic environment in the White House. And I thought I'd start here at sort of the 30,000-foot level, and then we can move from there into more details. But outside of the President, the White House Chief of Staff exercises the broadest influence over White House decision-making through his or her proximity to the President, control of process, and influence over personnel and structure. And I've always felt that the primary responsibility of the White House Chief of Staff is to ensure that the White House staff and organization support the President in making good decisions and implementing his policies. And I think that the White House Chief of Staff does that in 2 primary ways, 2 primary functions. The first, obviously, is to manage the White House personnel and structure, which includes maintaining the integrity of the decision-making process, which is a lot harder, as I'm sure Ken will mention here, a lot harder than it sounds on the surface. And it's basically enforcing an organizational scheme that produces sound analysis, sound options and recommendations for the President in a timely and effective manner. I think that's the primary responsibility. The secondary and equally important responsibility is speaking truth to power. And I think it's critically important for a chief of staff to be effective, to be able in private to tell the President of the United States what he needs to know but may not want to hear, and hopefully in the process acting as a restraint against impetuous behavior. And I've been on a couple of these panels with Ken and others, Republican and Democratic former White House chiefs of staff, and several of them have mentioned, and I think Ken may be one of them, that the most important word in the White House chief of staff's title is staff. The White House chief of staff is not the deputy president. It's the senior staff person whose job it is to impose some kind of order and control on the daily operation of the White House. Which leads to what I think is the primary challenge, again, the primary challenge facing the White House chief of staff, which is setting priorities, maintaining information flow to the president, and enforcing an internal decision-making process that is widely understood and widely respected by not only staff, but also by the president himself. And, you know, I've been doing this business a long time in Congress and in the White House, and I think there's three, I've always felt there's three foundational elements for success in this business. And that's the staff, having a good elected official, have good staff, and good organization. And the proper calibration of those three elements is materially affects the success that an administration or an office holder is going to have. And the chief of staff is the person primarily responsible for fine-tuning that calibration. Now, I think, and I'll wrap this up so Ken can add to this, but my view of the bottom line on presidential decision-making is the president has to have an effective structure to tee up and execute his decisions. He needs to have confidence in that structure and the people who staff it as he weighs his options. And I think the president will be much more effective if he operates under the general parameters of an internal decision-making process that, as I say, is widely understood and respected by staff. Now, that's easier said than done, and that's, in theory, it's a constant battle to try to enforce that. And I think there's a series of sort of second order of magnitude challenges that flow from the sort of overarching challenge, which is how to coordinate the disparate offices or elements of the executive office of the president on a daily basis, how to manage the president's time, how policies are developed, surfaced and vetted, how decisions are implemented, and equally important, how to minimize circumvention of process, which is always a big problem. So that's sort of my 30,000-foot sort of evaluation about what the primary challenge is for the White House Chief of Staff.
That was absolutely brilliant. And it was right on target. Let me join Pete in saying how honored I am to be with you, Bob, and with all of you at NYU Law School. We appreciate the opportunity. There is not much more that I can add to what Pete said, but let me try a little bit. It is not coincidental that most chiefs of staff start out at 6'4", and we wind up at our height now, which is about 5'8". You are the javelin catcher, so that the president doesn't have to do that. You're the SOB, so that the president doesn't have to be. In a different term of reference, I always refer to chief of staff as the person who is the reality therapist for the president of the United States. You're the person who has to say, that sounds good on its surface, but it won't fly. Not only are the votes not there, the votes can't be there. Oh, we better go back and take a fresh look at the options, because the first option's okay, but you get on that decision tree and every option that flows at the next fork in the road is unacceptable. You can't tolerate that. Pete said the key word, your staff, not chief. He's elected, you're not. Every time you open your mouth, the voice people hear is not your voice. It's the voice of the President of the United States. I once said that to Rahm Emanuel when he was joining, and he said, "Oh, expletive deleted." How do you involve the cabinet? The White House staff that Pete mentioned, so that everybody who needs to see a decision and have a chop on it gets to vet it without it leaking. And once the president makes that decision, you're in charge of the implementation of it. You're the one who has to put it into practice. You are at Command Central, and you walk up and down the hallway to the Oval Office 20 or 30 times a day. You get to decide who the president sees and who he doesn't. And most times, what he says and what he doesn't say. You have a lot of allies on the White House staff. Like Pete, I ran it as a partnership, and I might have been the most senior partner, but there are a whole bunch of partners sitting there with me, assistants to the president or cabinet officers. It's building a team. And so it is a team that has the Washington experience, plus the experience with the person who has become president during the campaign. It's that mix that really makes a difference. One of the things that I think has caused the current incumbent trouble is that the White House staff was absent government experience when they first took office, and it showed. You need to have that mix so that the president understands what's doable. So we're not tilting with windmills every day. We're reality-based. And that's the job of the White House Chief of Staff. And that's why we go from 6'4" to 5'9" every time.
Let me ask you a follow-up question about saying no to the president. So very few people in the stereotypical view of lawyers like it if lawyers are always saying no. But on the other hand, they might value that negativity in a chief of staff if the chief of staff is being candid with the president, as you said, Ken, about what is realistic for him to expect, et cetera. Now, without naming names or specific episodes, and perhaps you can even speak in purely hypothetical terms.
I don't do hypotheticals.
I'm speechless as a lawyer. I don't know what you could possibly be talking about. But let me ask you this. Let's assume that you were counseling a White House chief of staff. You were counseling Rahm Emanuel or whatever. And he wanted to ask you, is it appropriate if the president is hell-bent on what you think is a self-defeating or even destructive course of action? Is it somehow outside the toolkit of the White House chief of staff once he's had no success persuading the president that he's mistaken, to quietly lobby others, both within and outside the White House, to bring pressure to bear in every way possible to dissuade the president from that course? Is that dirty pool?
It can be dirty pool, but if you're enlisting people like the Senate Majority Leader or the Senate Minority Leader or the Speaker of the House or a prominent cabinet member to come in and have a discussion with the president, there are lots of ways of saying no without using the word no. Mr. President, we don't have to make that decision yet. We only have to do it when it's ripe to make it. Mr. President, I owe you more options. Let me develop them. And then slow walk it. It takes days. It takes a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you said to me, is it dirty pool? One of the things that occurred when I was White House Chief of Staff is we found that the president started backtracking on some foreign policy issues. And we realized that the person who was calling him was Maggie Thatcher. And we figured out that Cap Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, was talking to Maggie. And we shut that down very quickly by going to the president, not the Cap, and said, Mr. President, that is being set up. You are being set up.
By your own defense secretary.
My dear friend, Cap Weinberger. So, Mr. President, you can't take it at face value. You know, everybody walks into the Oval Office, almost everybody, and they get cotton in their mouth. They tell the president what they think he wants to hear, not what he needs to know. Your job is to tell him what he needs to know. It's not fun always telling the president no, not using that word. But that's the obligation that you have to be the White House Chief of Staff, to make sure you're protecting not only the president, but the presidency.
Pete?
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that, and I think that's an excellent explanation for this, but one of the most frustrating things I dealt with was when you're trying to maintain an open and an honest process for elevating issues and servicing issues, was the problem of circumvention of process. I mean, if you set up a process where everybody, where the chief of staff and the principal senior staff are running sort of a judicious process, not an imperial process. They're giving people opportunities to make their case. They're vetted through a variety of interests in the White House, and a decision is reached. Then you go into the president and you make the case and say, here's the issue, here are the options. Here's our recommendation. You discuss them back and forth, debate them, and a decision is made. Really, one of the most frustrating things, I think if you run a process like that, is then you find out the next day somebody's leaked something to the press, or somebody has tried to slip into the Oval Office on the side, or called a friend of the president's and had them call and relitigate it. So it's unavoidable, but I think one of the constant things you're always on the outlook for is efforts to circumvent process to relitigate a decision.
Let me ask you a follow-up about that, Pete, and Ken, please join in on this point. Don't you need the cooperation of the president? So what happens if the president, and there are some presidents, again, without naming names and that I've read about, let's put it that way, who have been inclined to do this, they're eager to have old friends on the phone, to call people late at night. And as a matter of fact, somewhere it's their way of, speaking of the chiefs of staff as the man, but what's the expression, giving it to the man, which is they're breaking through the process, they're breaking out of the bubble, they're at long last free to consult whom they want, when they want, on what they want. How do you deal with that when you're fighting your principal? Not just the people who want to come in to see him, but he who is at the door with open arms welcoming them in circumvention of the process.
Many times you have to explain to the president, well, that's not the full picture. They're looking at it through this microscope, and you need to look at it at a much broader lens. Whoops. You need to be able to say, Mr. President, they have a point of view, but this is what's doable. This is what's achievable. And your job as Chief of Staff is to define victories in ways that are achievable. And so while people are saying, you need to do this or need to do that, they don't have the entire picture. They don't have all the elements. It's, if you go this direction, you're going to lose this support on another piece of legislation or another policy. And people on the outside usually don't have that term of reference.
Pete?
Yeah, unlike Ken, I think I've only had the opportunity to say no to one president. So, and I will say about President Obama that he, he could get, annoyed at times, but he never discouraged staff, senior staff, from speaking their mind because he knew, I think, and he understood that that they had his best interest at heart. He may not ultimately agree, but they had their best interest at heart. Bob has probably had a number of those conversations with him when he was White House counsel. But these presidents have a wide range of contacts, influences, friends. You can't tell them they can't talk to people they knew outside the White House or who are friends or they respect their opinion. I don't know if this is crossing the line of confidentiality or not, but I do remember one example in the Senate when Senator Obama was a relatively new senator, and we were on the debate on John Roberts to be chairman of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and we had several weeks of fairly intense, long discussions with a number of people, the policy people, lawyers, political people, talking about what the right vote was, and it was a relatively close call. I think it's well documented in a number of books here that it was a relatively close call for him. And we'd gotten to the point where he had decided basically that he was going to vote against the nomination. And the next day we came in and he called me into the office and said, I was chief of staff in the Senate at the time, he says, I was talking to a former law student friend of mine from Harvard Law School who is on the national board of Planned Parenthood, and she really thinks I should vote for John Roberts because he's a brilliant legal mind. Now, which was a little bit of a shocker since we've been going through this for several weeks. And to be fair, we reconvened and had another series of conversations about this. And I won't say what pushed us over the edge here, but ultimately he decided, that maybe the original decision was right. He ended up voting against them, but also gave a speech which was, saying that it was a tough call for him. So this is what you got to expect this. It's not unusual and it's not unreasonable for these folks to be talking to people.
As long as the president discusses it with you.
Yeah. And to be fair, he called me in the next day and brought it up
Exactly
with me.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
I will say, this is a little bit of a non sequitur, but I love this story, so I'll tell it anyway, is that when Senator Obama first came to the Senate, he was obviously a hot commodity after the Boston Convention speech, and only African-American Democrats had taken a pasting in the election. And all of a sudden, he was getting speaking invitations, and people wanted to come in to see him. And every day, we'd get somebody said, I went to law school, Harvard Law School with Senator Obama, and he'd want to see me. Can I come in to see him? So our legislative director at the time, Chris Liu, who did go to Harvard Law School with Senator Obama, was in the same class, although they weren't close friends. He says, you know what we need to do? He says, I'm going to bring my yearbook in. So from then on, when anybody said, I'm a friend of Senator Obama's from Harvard Law School, we'd say, let's go to the yearbook.
You mentioned neutrality. Honest brokering, that the chief of staff is staff, not a principal. So let me take the question of the president doing something self-destructive and move it to the policy sphere. Not so much that the president's tactics are mistaken or that the president's about to do something that's politically foolish, but that in a policy debate, national security, what have you, the president's going to make a decision that you, the chief of staff, think is a really bad decision. Bad decision, just on the merits. So the process is one that you've convened, all the arguments have been brought to bear, but you're the person who has the opportunity at the very, very end in the Oval Office, frankly, as often as you choose, one-on-one with the president, to make a closing argument against what it is he apparently is inclined to do. Now, other members of the staff may fear that's exactly what you're doing, right? Because you have that access. How do you address that sort of dilemma?
Well, I can only speak to President Obama's approach, and much like Ken described his experience, we had a core group of senior staff people who brought different things to the table, from the chief of staff, 3 senior advisors, White House counsel, the heads of the policy councils, various national security advisor, and depending on the issue, I think very rarely, if ever, was a policy decision discussed without a cross-section of people in that room who would express their views, and the political people as well, the communications people. And so, and the President Obama had always said that, that his chief of staff was the first among equals. And I think he basically, that's the way he operated, that I don't recall in the limited time I was chief of staff, or even for the other chiefs of staff we had, where he would meet one-on-one with really anybody and relitigate a decision or make a decision. If they wanted to relitigate, he'd say, bring the people together again. And we'd get the group back in and discuss it. And I think his real goal here was that any major decision that was made, that the whole senior team, or certainly the relevant cross-section of the senior team, understood it, had a chance to express their view on it, and would move forward to defend it.
And we had a similar experience to what Pete just said. You had the people in the room. You know, one of the things I learned about President Reagan was that he was much better when he was hearing the arguments in person rather than just on a piece of paper. While he looked at the papers and did his homework, maybe it's his training as an actor, but he always would see, when we put the staff together, anybody who has a vested interest in, not in the decision, but in a point of view on the policy, give them their chance to argue it in front of the president so that the president feels comfortable he's heard all the perspectives. Now, Reagan would not make a decision in those meetings. And so the White House Chief of Staff, first among equals, would ultimately sit and talk with the president. And you have to be viewed by the staff and the cabinet as the honest broker, so that the president is using you as a sounding board. Is there something else that I'm missing? I don't feel comfortable with that argument. And that gives you your opportunity to weigh in.
But,
Yeah,
but I assume,
can I just add
please,
one
go
thing
do-
to that? Because in the Obama example, we had a senior staff meeting every morning at 7:30 in the morning, where everything that was anticipated to come up that day that we were going to bring up with the president, this group of people was probably 8 to 12 people, would the chief of staff would outline the agenda, everybody would add to the agenda, we'd all discuss it. So whenever we went into a meeting with the president, everybody knew what arguments were out there, what the issue was, who was going to say what, where we were. We tried to get to as much of a consensus as we could get, but you often didn't get to a total consensus because these are 51-49 calls a lot of the time. So our basic mode of operandi here was to have the senior staff work these things through before they go into the president.
And very similarly, every morning at 8 o'clock, I met with 8 assistants to the president, the core group. And we looked at the day, we looked at the decisions that were going to have to be made that day, the meetings that were going to take place, who was going to be in those meetings. At 8:30, we met with all the assistants to the president in the Roosevelt Room. And so you're now talking about 18 or 20 people. And that was much more of a show and tell. But the real meeting was the first meeting. And so we were all lined up, whether it was the NSC or the domestic council, all lined up so that we knew what our responsibilities were for that day and who was going to be present for each of those decisions, each one of those policy discussions.
You mentioned, I think, in your answer to the first question, Ken, and I'd like you and Pete to talk about this for a second, leaks. So you're trying to administer a process within the White House that is rigorous and one that's fair to the president in particular in preparing him to make a decision. Number one, describe for me both the frustrations and the approaches to dealing with leaks, people using the press either to aggrandize in themselves or to potentially influence the decision from the outside? And secondly, do you think it's worse? It's gotten worse? And thirdly, if it's gotten worse, why?
You're talking about unauthorized leaks.
From within the White House. Well, yes, that's a good follow-up question. Yeah. And who is authorized to leak
At that particular moment.
at that particular moment?
Leaks drive you crazy. Unauthorized leaks drive you crazy because sometimes you can't figure out where they're coming from. But you got to remember, your job as chief of staff is to keep everybody on the president's agenda and not their agenda. You're the one who's looking out for the president, not for a particular item that you may be pushing. There's always suspicion in any White House, in every White House, that the leak's going to take place, and it has gotten much worse. We had a 24-hour news cycle. Now you have 24 seconds, maybe. And so the access with emails, et cetera, is instantaneous. And the press, I think, is damn good at ferreting all that out. But again, you have to have people on the White House staff who feel like they have a piece of the action, that they've had their say, that it was an honest process. The president made a decision, and now it's time to salute. And that's part of your job as a disciplinarian and as a leader.
I'd make 2 points here. One of which is I didn't really realize until I actually got into the White House the sort of varied nature of leaks, because a lot of these leaks are nowhere close to the source of the decisions. They come from people who are 2, 3 times, 4 times removed from the decision. Half the time they're wrong. It's people talking about stuff or trying to be relevant or whatever. But the other point I would make, I asked Bob to address this because as White House counsel, I can remember a lot of time you had to spend with, because everybody, for the chief of staff, we all know how frustrated Rahm Emanuel can get, from Rahm to the president himself, how frustrated they are about leaks. But by the same token, they don't want to go on a jihad against leaks, and there's individual rights. They don't want to be accusing people or cutting into their freedoms. And I seem to recall that you spent a lot of time trying to find what the right balance was on this.
And actually never did. So that's one of the reasons I asked the question. On the question of we're talking here in this conference about constraints. And obviously some constraints are legal constraints. I'll get to the role of the White House counsel shortly so that Pete can vent his rage. But also there are ethical constraints as well. What are the requirements in your view for building and then enforcing a culture within the White House that we could call a robust or healthy ethical culture that operates at least as some kind of limitation on behaviors that are consistent with the principles that the president would articulate for himself, but that any president would articulate for any administration?
That's a hard one to answer because, my immediate reaction is almost anything I say sounds like I'm hero worship of Barack Obama. But I think it starts with the president himself and his values and the message he's sending to people about what he's going to tolerate and what he won't tolerate. And I like to think, history will tell over time that the 8 years of the Obama administration, he had a pretty good ethical record. And this is a big government. This is a little bit of a non sequitur, but I remember the story that President Obama has told publicly, so I'm not saying anything I haven't heard publicly, but also told me privately, was right after he had been sworn in and he had convinced, or at least he had been elected and he convinced Secretary Gates to continue as Secretary of Defense. Secretary Gates had served 7 presidents and obviously was a very well-credentialed Republican, and he convinced him to stay on. And he said they were leaving the Oval Office, and I believe this might be slightly exaggerated, but I believe this is what President Obama would say. He leaned over to Secretary Gates and said, you know, you've been in 7 administrations, served 7 presidents. What insights can you give me about what I can expect in this job, and so I can be ready for it? And I think Secretary Gates, with a little bit of a twinkle in his eye, said, well, Mr. President, you got to think of it this way. There's over 2 million people, including military personnel, that work for the federal government, that work for you. You have a $3.5 trillion budget. I can pretty much assure you that every day somebody somewhere is screwing something up. You know. So, I mean, I think you just have to, in terms of the ethics, you just have to say what you expect and have the president and his senior people try to enforce it, and things are going to happen. Some of them are inadvertent, some of them, you know, less so. But I think, and I hope, over time, history will show that at least the 8 years of the Obama administration, which is the only administration I've worked for, will come out okay in that regard.
You know, the old Russian proverb that Reagan used to use all the time, roughly translated, trust but verify. He trusted everybody, and I was the verifier. And if I wasn't, Nancy Reagan was. What Pete said was, it starts at the top. And it certainly started with Ronald Reagan and his values. And that, I think, permeated the whole place.
Going up Pennsylvania Avenue for a second to Capitol Hill, it's always been my impression that if a member of Congress, and granted they deal and their staff deals with the Office of Congressional Liaison and so forth, but if a member of Congress wants to talk to the president but can't actually talk to the president or doesn't believe that's the first stop, the member of Congress wants to talk to the White House Chief of Staff.
Correct.
So can you talk a little bit about the share of time that you spend, regardless of which party controls the Congress, managing the relationship with the Congress?
Well, I've been on both sides of this because the first term I was assistant to the president for legislative affairs, and then I came back as chief of staff. As chief of staff, you have to remember you're not the chief congressional liaison. Because if you don't remember that, you're going to spend 24 hours a day doing that job and not the chief of staff job. And so you needed somebody high-profile staffer in the legislative affairs who knew everybody on the Hill, who could help with those phone calls. So that even if I were to take the phone call, the response that got returned was returned by the person from Congressional Relations. That gave him or her a chop on everything. That's the way you start dealing with it. But, you know, it goes back to cotton in your mouth. Congressmen would scream occasionally, "You're not being fair, you're not being right, you're all base. I need 5 minutes on the president's calendar." And you would hold that off and hold that off. And you finally said, "Oh, what the hell, Mr. President, you got to see this congressman for 5 minutes. He's, you know, chairman of this committee or whatever." And the congressman would walk into the Oval Office. "Mr. President, it's great to see you. Thanks for taking the time for me to say hello. Shook hands. I really don't want to bother you with anything more," and walk out. And Reagan would say, "I thought he was mad at you. What happened? I thought we were screwing up on something." All he wanted was that photograph from the White House photographer of him in the Oval Office shaking the hand of the president. And he could write whatever he wanted underneath that. Like, the congressman visited the Oval Office to complain about this, this, and this. That's what you put up with sometimes when you're dealing with Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I had a similar experience in that, like Ken, who was also a chief of staff in the Senate as well. When I came to the White House, I was just 4 years removed from being chief of staff to the Senate Democratic leader. So a number of the, particularly on the Democratic Senate side and the Republicans in the Senate, not so much the House, these folks were used to working with me. And we had a very senior assistant to the president for legislative affairs, Phil Shalero. It's been 28 years in the House and was very well respected in the House. So, I found anyway that while I was there, that yes, senators would call me, but they were pretty respectful about time because they were pretty savvy too. And if they could get something without bothering the chief of staff, or they would do that. They weren't going to call Ken or me up about 2 extra tickets to the Christmas party or something like that. So I never really, there were some. I've been yelled at by Senator Sanders a number of times about Social Security and things like that, but that's, par for the course. And to be fair to him, he feels strongly about the issue, and, he wasn't going to get to the president to yell at him, so he got to make his case to me, and I think he appreciated that and felt passionately about it. So I actually always enjoyed the interaction I had with members of Congress, and never really felt that any of them, took advantage of it or went too far.
Never.
And the other part of it too, the other part of it too is if you've worked in Congress before and know the psychology of it, you can work this to your advantage too. To take preemptive strikes and knowing to reach out. I'll tell you, it's you don't want to always be back there on the receiving end when something matters to them. You want to take advantage to reach out. When you're doing something for them as well.
Right.
Yeah. I can't resist, and I don't think this is a violation of any privilege or confidence, and I think it does speak well for you, Pete, but it probably explains more of your MO, and maybe a little bit of your laughing a bit at the notion that members of Congress don't go too far. I remember when I was there with you, one United States senator who was insistent, rather shrilly, that she needed gobs of time to discuss some dissatisfaction. And you wound up giving her 3 hours, and in return, she bought you takeout Chinese food.
At her home.
At her home, exactly, for 3 hours. So I wouldn't say that's going too far, would you? Let me ask you a question about the cabinet. So when I was in the White House, and I've certainly heard about this outside the White House, of course, there's been much talk about the sensitivity to presidential administration, meaning sort of continued absorption into the White House of many of the functions of government and the weakening of the role of the cabinet. And cabinet officers feeling quite marginalized, particularly on the larger decisions within their sphere of responsibility, not the day-to-day regulatory activity, but the really major ticket items, if you will, on the president's agenda that connect to their substantive expertise. Is that a trend that's just fundamentally irreversible and they simply need to be sort of managed and sweet-talked into accepting it? Or is there a significant problem, and how would a chief of staff address it if the potential role that the cabinet can play is steadily weakened?
I think you have to get over the fiction that this is a cabinet government. It is White House centric. And the more we get into modern times, the more obvious it is to me that it has to be the White House. But when you get into questions of operational, then it's a mistake that you can't make. For example, the NSC getting involved as they did in Iran-Contra. That became operational. That's a mistake. But the key is to get the cabinet thoroughly involved. Look, the Secretary of State, Defense, Attorney General, and Treasury spend an inordinate amount of time in the White House. Most of the other cabinet officers do not. How do you get them involved? Our way of thinking was that a cabinet officer is good for a year and a half before they're captured by the bureaucracy and the interest groups. You can extend that if you bring them into the White House process. I'm not talking about the daily, memos, et cetera. One of the things that I did was organize a weekly lunch for 3 or 4 cabinet officers in the Chief of Staff's office. And invariably, the president would come for dessert the last 15 minutes. The cabinet officer could say when he went back, well, when I was at the White House earlier today or 2 days ago, when I saw the president earlier this week, and that strengthened the cabinet officer's ability to use the bully pulpit as a major player in the administration. To me, that's where we're evolving. This idea of having a cabinet meeting, it's show and tell. Cabinet meetings aren't decision-making. They probably never were, at least in modern times. But now it's much more, how do you get them involved rather than the big show and tell that we see so much of?
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. I mean, I think Ken is right that we have. You're never going to have cabinet-centric government. It's the power in an administration is decision-making power is moving more and more to the White House, and I think that what that does is it makes effective two-way communication between the White House and the cabinet an ongoing challenge and often a source of mutual frustration. And the way I look at it, I think there's some truth on both sides of this. I think that I do believe that the White House, at least the people I worked with in the White House, senior staff, appreciate the role and the contribution of the cabinet. But in the day-to-day oppressive business, particularly these days, they do struggle trying to fully integrate the cabinet into the decision, the policy development and implementation process, particularly if you're in one of the not the top 4 agencies or departments. But I also think that the cabinet secretaries and staff, have a legitimate feeling that they're underutilized, underappreciated, and they sort of chafe at the perception that they're not getting their due respect, that White House staff is micromanaging at times the departments, and that the White House staff is often too concerned about political considerations. So this tension goes back and forth. And you also have cabinet. I don't know any cabinet secretary in the Obama administration, even the ones who I thought were very effective and I have great affection for, who didn't think that the president would benefit by more of their time and expertise and opinions, not only on their own issues, on other issues as well. Exactly. So, and I remember one agency staff person telling me once that sort of the agency view of the White House is they say if there's a bad story in the White House, press story in the White House will say, that's a terrible biased story by a hostile reporter. If there's a bad story in an agency, they say that's a terribly politically tone-deaf decision by the agency, And I just think that's going to be unavoidable. And the one last anecdote I will say is that Secretary Moniz, who came in the second term, who was, I think, a very effective cabinet secretary, a brilliant guy, and a really contributor to the second term of the Obama administration. I remember about a year and a half after I'd left the White House, I was down having lunch with his chief of staff, who I've known for years, and Secretary Moniz was having lunch by himself and asked me to come in and chat with him. So we chatted, and we had a really nice conversation. And then he said, by the way, do you remember that you interviewed me for the secretary job between Christmas and New Year's after the 2012 election? I said, yeah. He said, Valerie Jarrett talked to me, and then you talked to me, and then I went in to see the president. Yeah, I said, I remember that. He said, remember you told me that you thought that in the first term, the White House didn't do as good a job as it could, really integrating cabinet secretaries into the flow of things and finding the right balance in the relationship with the White House and the president, and that you really thought that was going to change now that the election was over and we're moving into the second term. I said, yeah, I remember that. He says, I just want you to know that it hasn't changed.
Isn't one of the concerns, though, with what you say, Ken, is the reality of cabinet government, that the White House's absorption of all of these functions and the cabinet's relatively more limited. Again, on the bigger ticket items, contributions means you have a White House, and I would think this would be a major concern for the Chief of Staff. Maybe it's unavoidable, that's just simply overburdened. That you have too few, I always had the impression, Robert Gibbs used to say, working in the White House is like living on a submarine. You're in a limited amount of space with a lot of people knocking into each other, sleepless, disoriented, and afflicted by other human conditions like vanity. And the question is, what is the answer to the limited resources of the White House, but its apparent endless appetite for taking on responsibilities?
You have to have people on the White House staff who know how to work with the cabinet agency, so they get the best out of the cabinet agency and give it to the assistant to the president for a particular area. That's the only way it can work. You're right in the whole description of everybody on the White House staff. Overworked, overburdened, sleepless. You know, I lived on chocolate and Diet Coke. Really good for my health. And you never get turned off. It's a 24-hour job. You know, the old campaign ad against President Obama by Hillary Clinton, who do you want on the other end of the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning? Who do you trust on it? I think that was the ad. It's not the president. It's the chief of staff. And your decision is whether or not to awaken the president. And then you can put into process the response of the United States government. And then you're supposed to go back to sleep for a couple hours and get to start all over again the next day. You got to figure out other ways to share the burden. And so you need to have confidence in the cabinet officer or the deputy secretary of this department. And so that you need those touchstones that help bring everything together. And the chief of staff has to wind that all up. So it's not just a White House clearance process, for example. It's an administration clearance process so that you have things taken care of. Now, let me just relate a quick story. And there was a big speech that the president was about to give. And through the interagency clearance process, said that the State Department objected to a paragraph in the speech. And so I conveyed that to the president. The day before the speech, then Secretary of State George Shultz called me and said, I hope that you understand, I share my department's objection to that paragraph in the speech, and I hope you'll convey my views to the president. And I knew at that moment that the speech was okay with George Shultz because he had those 30 minutes on the president's calendar twice a week and was never shy about asking me for 10 minutes to discuss something with the president. But by saying, will you convey my views to the president, he was saying, if the speech bombs, it's on your shoulders, not mine. I'm covered with my bureaucracy. Period. End of story. Excuse me, almost end of story. The objection from the State Department was over the line. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Because they thought it was too provocative and would undercut Mikhail Gorbachev on perestroika and glasnost. George Shultz was covered and put it on my shoulders so that if that speech in fact had bombed, next White House Chief of Staff.
You made the right call.
Right.
We've got about 5 minutes left. If there are any questions, please send them on down this way. And as the question, if there are any, let me just, as my last question, ask you, would you like to speak to the indispensability of the role of the White House counsel?
Yeah, let me, Pete will verify this. We met in between the outgoing and the incoming administrations just now. We had 10 or 12 of us as former White House chiefs of staff giving advice to Reince Priebus. And one of the questions he asked us was, what are the jobs that he really needed to control inside the White House? And almost with unanimity, we said, the staff secretary, so that you have the paper flow and you control that, and the White House counsel, because that's the person who will keep you and the president out of trouble.
It's a great answer.
Since you led with that question,
Yeah.
I will say,
Go ahead.
say that when we started out, as I mentioned, we had senior advisor meeting every morning that the president was in town, and initially the White House Counsel was not part of that meeting. The White House Counsel was added to that meeting about 9 months into the first year when Bob joined the staff, and for the year and a half that Bob was there, he was at every one of those senior meetings and made an indispensable contribution to them, I hate to admit.
And it is a first admission. This is a question actually that you may not be in a position to answer, which is, do you see any difference in the engagement in the current administration with the cabinets? Is there any?
With the cabinet?
With the cabinets. That is to say, there's a different, that the Trump administration has a different approach to the cabinet's involvement in policymaking.
I think you may have considerable strength among some members of the cabinet, and not just in the top 3 or 4. For example, the Commerce Department with Wilbur Ross, I think is a real grown-up, a real adult who knows his business and is influential with the White House and with the president. I think Elaine Chao at Transportation, similarly.
Okay, we're coming. I think we can squeeze a few more questions in. You both discussed that it's often your role to tell the president no. Are there times that when you have to be constrained in tempering the president in order to preserve goodwill?
I don't understand the question.
I don't entirely either, but I think the gist of it is it's less a question of policy and more a question of politics that you're trying to influence the president on.
You can't pull your punches with
Oh,
the
I see.
president.
I think I do understand that you're pulling the punch in order to sustain your credibility with the president. You may not wish to temper because you're concerned about the president's reaction having an adverse adverse effect on your working relationship.
Your job is to be the reality therapist and to tell the president what he needs to know. And, you know, sometimes there's a cost to that. But most presidents, certainly the ones that I've dealt with, accept that. That's your role. And they have designated you first among equals as far as assistants to the president. They have vested in you. They put their arm around you saying, he, so far, just he's, but there will be hers soon, I bet. That's my person. When you close the door with the President of the United States and you're giving him art and varnished, you're still rounding some corners in the way you describe it to the President. Mm-hmm. That's why I said you don't use the word no, but you come up with different devices, and that's how you preserve it. Look, if the President loses faith in you or your credibility, you're no good in the job. You've outlived your usefulness.
Yeah, I've never felt that I paid any kind of a personal cost for being honest with the president. You know, that's what he expects. I did it diplomatically.
That's why you're there.
And that's why you're there. And I've never felt I paid any kind of a personal price for that.
All right.
Well, we're at the end here, and so thank you very, very much, the two of you. Really outstanding.